All right, so if anyone wants to come up, feel free or send through the app, and we're going to get it in. I'll be the first one, and Chris, why don't you answer my messages?
Which messages? Pretty sure I answered your message last night at midnight.
Yeah, we actually talk every day, so yeah. So I'll start with the one from the app, which is, I think this is a cool one to get started. Where did the name, I heard this story, but I barely remember it. So where did the name Phoenix come from?
That's a great question. So I'm going to turn my volume down, so I'll have to use Jose's body language if he needs to come in. All right, so the name came from, well, one, the name had to be awesome. So I was trying to figure out before really I started Phoenix what the name would be. And I need to find like the Evernote, back when Evernote was a thing, of all the names, but I was trying to find something that fit within the Elixir ecosystem. I looked into a bunch of like Greek mythology names, but they all were either taken or not great, like Hydra, or there was a bunch of names that like I didn't love, but I found, but they were already an open source project. And then settled on Phoenix, which is kind of like a perfect fit for like the metaphor of the beam. You've got this like bird that dies and is respawned to relive again. So it kind of played into process supervision and resilient systems. So it was kind of a perfect name for the metaphor of kind of what the platform provides. And it wasn't taken, well, sorry, it wasn't taken from anything irrelevant. I think Microsoft had some kind of Phoenix compiler project, and then Firefox was also like, there were a couple things from like a couple decades prior that people on Hacker News complained about, but in general, Phoenix was an available name.
Wasn't it also like Jacqueline's idea? Jacqueline is his wife, or she involved in the process, right?
Yeah, so she helped me come up with names. So I'd have to find, or have to re-ask her if that was like her original idea, or she definitely came up with names with me.
Cool. So no takers here yet, so we'll continue online. Okay, so let's go for a tough one. What was the most regrettable decision you made in Phoenix or LiveView?
Oh my goodness. Regrettable. I don't know, that's a good one. So I think there's probably a number of small things. I think the whole thing around Phoenix context was not regrettable. I still think it was the correct decision, but it was a long time, a lot of work for, I think, we've had some frustration from newcomers when they're suddenly forced with kind of new ideas. And then, so sometimes I feel like it pleased no one. Like experts are like, why is Phoenix prescribing the way I write this code? And we're like, the context generators are for beginners and not for you. And they're like, yes, but why are you prescribing the way to write my code? And meanwhile, some beginners are like, why are you making this harder? So I think that's not regrettable. I still think it was the right call, but I still think that's one of the more thankless, didn't please anyone things that we've done. Outside of that, I've been pretty happy with where we landed on most things. I didn't quite think LiveView would be such a JavaScript intensive workflow for what I spend my time doing, but that's kind of a necessary evil. So I think that probably covers it.
Cool. So there is another one, which is where, I'll take this one, Chris, I believe. Where did the Elixir name come from? And somebody did a throw emoji. So I don't have a very good answer for that. The name was simply there. And the fun thing, like, yeah, it was like, oh, I'm going to call it, oh, Elixir. That was there. I took a very pragmatic approach, like, oh, it's relatively short. It's the letter E in the alphabet, so if somebody's listing languages alphabetically, it's going to come like relatively up. Close to our lang as well, same initial letter, 6 letters, so that was so I was like, let's go with this. And the funny thing is that understandably, it led a lot of projects in the ecosystem to take this like more, as Chris was saying, like this more like mythological vibe, like Phoenix, Hydra, and so on. And for a really long time, I actually didn't see that. So for example, the build tool is called Mix, which for me was always like about mixing like the code and compiling the code, right? But there is like a whole different understanding that people say like, oh, it's related with mixology or something like that, that I never saw from where it came from. And then there is hex, which was like, cool, like it's a hexagon, like hexadecimal, right? That's cool. And there's like, no, hex is like cursing somebody, like you can throw a hex. And then I was like, really? So, and then there is ecto as well, which for me is, it comes from the Latin, like the outer part, like the ecto, like ectoderm, right? So I was like, oh, this is cool, right? Um, ecto is a layer around the database, right? So it makes total sense. And then somebody's like, nope, it was named after the ghost from Ghostbusters. And I'm like, damn it. So, yeah. Okay, I'm jumping in and out here. So, Chris, what is missing in LiveView in order to release the 1.0 version?
Probably a lot of stuff. So I'm trying to think in my unload in my head a bunch of stuff we've recently talked about. So the programming model I feel like is very baked and in place for a long time now, but I still think we have a lot to prove out. So we don't want to rush to a 1.0 and then be constantly breaking expectations of people. So I think it's in a stable state in like how you would write a LiveView application, but there's a couple big things. One, Marlis's recent contributions have been huge, and that's kind of like just a starting point of we've got a HTML aware template engine, but then going forward to like really take it to where our vision is of being able to have like off-the-shelf reusable components. We definitely need something along the lines of slots to be able to have someone release a library and say, like, here's your Tailwind table, and then you can just say, here's what I want a row to look like. So slots is a big feature. I think Marlis has done a lot of interesting work around compile time checks that it wouldn't be required for 1.0, but that's currently kind of on our mind just as a developer UX experience. But outside of that, there's a couple outstanding things that we kind of have to experience in the wild, like what it looks like to build a big LiveView application. So I think one of the big missing things is a component LiveView messaging abstraction. So if you've got this tree of components, you can do a send update and you can send to a LiveView process, but there's no shared abstraction for messaging, sending things up and down component tree to LiveViews themselves. So I think that would be kind of a requirement for me to figure out what that looks like. And I think a lot of that will come from what people are actually building in the wild. So that's definitely on our mind, on the roadmap. But I think before we land on a 1.0, we'd have to have that kind of solved.
Yeah, sorry for the delay because I have to unmute in the bottom corner. Okay, so I'm seeing what is next. Okay, so this is a good question to both of us. You go first, Chris. How do you prioritize work, open source, and private life?
Priorities help when you're getting paid to do open source. So I'll say that the answer before I was being employed and able to balance my life out by working on Phoenix during company time, it was much harder to prioritize things. It was kind of helped by the fact that my wife was in residency, so I had a lot of time without having to like sacrifice family time. But it definitely is like a situation for burnout if you're just trying to like pour yourself into big open source projects completely on your free time. So I think how I'm able to balance is having companies like Dockyard or now Fly.io actually pay me to mostly work on open source. So it's a privileged position to be in, but that definitely helps. And how I actually prioritize features, it's pretty haphazard. Kind of depends on what either someone using Phoenix in the wild needs, or kind of our long-term roadmaps that we have. I mean, like Phoenix Presence or Phoenix Live View kind of just came out of us being like, hey, how would we solve this kind of thing? Or, hey, wouldn't it be crazy if we did this? And then that turns into, a couple of years of work. So I think that there's priorities that Jose have in our shared collective brains or random notes that exist. There are roadmaps on the issues tracker, but I think day to day, it kind of depends on, if someone opens a bug, obviously that's higher priority. Or if I have time just to go heads down, it's usually around some kind of live view feature these days. But yeah, the life stuff is probably the most important, because if you burn out, then you're not serving yourself or anyone in the community. So I think it's important to definitely prioritize family and everything else above trying to ship code.
Yeah, I think there is one thing that Chris and I have in common, and we are really thankful for the companies we work at and the companies we work on, is that for us, like, work and open source is pretty much the same thing. So I think that's one of the things to keep in mind. Like, when you see us being very productive, you have to, like, doing a lot of public work, remember that a lot of that's part of our work. We, of course, have work things to do, which is actually a good fallback. Like, when I'm tired from open source, I can just go and do the small part of my work that is actually the responsibility that I actually have to do. And I can forget about the rest 80% open source, and I can still feel happy about it. But yeah, that's a big advantage. And it's something that sometimes, if anybody here is maintaining your own project, is something to keep in mind. And there's a lot of discussions nowadays in the community, not only the Elixir community, but in open source in general, how to make it more sustainable and so on, right? So for us, it's a big boost. And originally, I struggle a lot with balancing like private life and work. But personally, when I had kids, it's kind of like, it's kind of decided for you. So I got much better at that after I had kids. I also joke, like, as a Brazilian living in Poland, where we have like very cold winters, I was like, well, it's winter. I'm going to go outside. No, I'm going to stay home, and I'm going to work. So like Elixir was actually, the both the initial prototype and the version that became Elixir what is today, they were both done during the winter. So you get you get an idea about that. Yeah. So okay, Chris, do you talk to creators of other web frameworks? Who you drew inspiration from, like Rails or other web frameworks in general? How does that go?
Not like web server frameworks. I'm trying to think if I've talked with anyone directly, but I am in contact with open source folks. Like most recently, Caleb Parizo, the Alpine JS author, he and I have chatted several times about how he's solving. He's creator of LiveWire. It's like a live view solution for PHP Laravel's framework. So he and I chat, but I'm trying to think if I've had significant conversations with server folks, not directly. I'm trying to think. I've got an email from DHH turning down my application in 2013 to apply 37 signals, but that's the closest I've gotten to talk to another web framework author.
All right. So sometimes I want to ask feedback on the questions, but I don't think I can do that. So somebody said, can you tell us about the new graphic shared on Twitter? Did you share anything, Chris, or is that for me?
That's got to be for you. I'm assuming the Explorer.
So a couple, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, or maybe last week, I shared so we recently started this effort for Elixir for machine learning, and I was trying to find like in none of the projects I had worked on or started, I never had a mascot, and sometimes you get like envy, right? Because some projects they have like very nice, cute mascots, like something I can bring for the kids at home. So when we were starting this the numerical Elixir project, I was trying to find a mascot, and then I literally I knew it was numerical Elixir, so I literally went to Wikipedia, animals starting with the letter N, and I found this animal called Numbat, which you probably saw the logo. It's very specific to Australia. Unfortunately, it's threatened with extinction. They think there's probably like about 1,000 of them, and I was like, this is perfect, right? Because it's like like numeric, right? Numbat. It's perfect. So the next thing I did was to see if it's not an animal that's trying to kill people, right? Especially being based in Australia, but he's actually very cute. He's only eat termites, so it became the logo, and I have been teasing this thing for a while. So all the logos, they are built on top of the Numbat, and yeah, so all the projects that we do, there's usually a logo related with it. So it came with an X, which is something like for working with matrices, like multidimensional matrices called tensors and so on. And then there was the Livebook project we had some presentations on. So if you saw the Livebook logo, it's a mixture of like this Numbat thing. I wish I could show, but hey, Chris, do you have the Numbat swag around you?
The actual stuffed animal.
The push toy.
Hold on. Oh, it was actually on my desk. I think
Okay,
my wife
so
removed it
Chris will be
so the
working
dog
while
wouldn't get it.
yeah. So then we have the live book,
They
and the
sent me
latest one.
a actual plush toy, but the closest I have is
That's the
this guy right
Numbat.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not an actual Numbat. It's a postcard of the Numbat. But yeah. So the latest one was there's this new project that has already been announced. It's on GitHub. It's started by Chris Granger. I'm not sure I pronounced his last name correctly, not Chris McCord. So Chris, he's in Australia, and he started a project called Explorer, which is about so whoever has some familiarity with the Python ecosystem, there's the pandas library, right, which is for data frames. And what data frames are is basically, imagine you want to work with like tabular data and make it very easy to rearrange the data, select, filter, right? That's kind of what it does. So Explorer is the same idea brought to Elixir. And then we're like, okay, let's make it. Chris is doing a great work, and we're like, okay, let's bring this into an X. So we need a logo, right? And the name Explorer is great because a lot of things that you do with data frame is actually because of tabular data is that you are exploring the data, right? So like, okay, let's think with the logo. And then my first idea, because of Explorer, was to give the Numbat like an Indiana Jones look, like kind of giving him a small hat and a whip. But the designer who works on those things with us, he's Javier. He's actually, if you've ever been to Elixir Conference in the United States, he actually does all of the art for the Elixir Conference in the United States. That's how I met him. He's very wise because he never listens to my ideas when it comes to design. And then he said, you're talking about exploration, so what if we put the Numbat in space? So that was what the most recent tease was about. So the Explorer project, and about data exploration, and the Numbat became a astronaut. So it's pretty cool. Yeah. All right. Let's go back to questions after story time. Okay, let's go with a specific one, Chris. Have you the answer to this one may be a no, but have you seen what Rails will do with ES6 HTTP2 import maps? Any plans to adopt the same approach, or ES build will stay for a while?
That's a good question. So first of all, I'm kind of jealous of the Explorer logo because I'm a huge space nerd, and before I named, like, going back to the Phoenix name for a second, before I chose the Phoenix name, I tried to force a space name onto the framework because I love space so much. But like all the names were either already taken or like just kind of like too nerdy. Like I'm a big nerd, but like Pulsar, like they were just like too much. I couldn't find a good name, so now that, like, because I wanted like an awesome space logo, so now a Numbat in space is I'm jealous. I need to put the Phoenix in space somehow. Anyway, that's an aside. So yeah, that's a good question. So first my first hot take of let's not require Node at all was actually to do HTTP2 import maps, just script tags on the page. We explored that initially, and I think that's awesome because like it's back to the like early days of the web, but it's not terrible because you're not doing like a ton of HTTP requests and blocking the page. But what we ultimately landed on is it still doesn't take you very far, because even if you're using HTTP2, you still have dozens of requests going to the server to fetch individual assets. You don't get minification, which is also a big shame. So I think that it's a great option for folks if they literally want no build step. But I think ESBuild, being a portable Go binary that should work 5 years from now, is the next best thing. So I think it's neat that Rails also explored really the same paths that we did. I think we just didn't think that the import maps would be a good default for folks that would actually grow with them. Like it works out of the box really well if all you're doing is serving like app CSS and app JS, but the moment you add in a charting library, add in all these other utilities, you suddenly have a ton of JavaScript files being fetched. So that's kind of the longer answer to that, but I think it's a reasonable approach for stuff with a very constrained JavaScript and asset story.
I may be misremembering, but isn't import maps still like fighting its way to have like proper browse support across everything? Does anybody know? Like, no?
It could be. I mean, I think ultimately, even if it was well supported today, it wouldn't change our answer. But if it's still not completely supported, that's definitely a consideration too for folks. But I think ESBuild, as far as its staying power, the nice thing about it, like I said, is the fact that it's a portable Go binary. So like if it works for you today to bundle your CSS and JS, it will work 5 years from now if you deploy an app today. So I think it's less about like, Webpack 3, when we first shipped Webpack, it worked. We could say, oh, Webpack 3 works today, but then we couldn't say 5 years when you revisit your code base that's going to work at all. And actually it won't. That's what we've seen. So I think that the ESBuild story is like, even if we were to say like ESBuild is abandoned 5 years from now, there's something better. Literally like a precompiled Go binary is just going to spin up, do the thing that it did years prior. So I think there's a much better long-term story there, even if ESBuild were to fall out of favor. Like our whole goal is like long-term maintainability for applications that you start and continue in the future.
Yeah, and I don't know, has anybody tried already the new Phoenix stuff with ESBuild? Please raise your hands. About a dozen hands up, maybe a bit more. So the cool thing about ESBuild, for those who tried, is that like if you don't have ESBuild in your machine, it just goes and download it and put it under the _build directory, and you don't have to do anything else, right? Which is just for the getting started experience, regardless if you're new to Phoenix or an existing project, it's just so refreshing, right? Because they're not telling like, hey, you should go there, figure out how to install Node in your system, figure out how to install NPM, and then do the NPM install, right? It's just like, no, the version was declared somewhere, we're just going to go and fetch it, as if it was like kind of an Elixir package. And I think this is a really big deal and ties in really nice with like what Chris is saying, right? It should still work in 5 years, right? And yeah, in 5 years, we'll most likely still have internet. We can just go and grab that thing and put it in the proper place. Okay. All right, so now I'll go with a question that left me very disappointed. I'm kidding. But it is, what thing in Elixir or Phoenix frustrates you, but isn't top priority, so you decide to leave it be? It's like, come on, man, we're working hard. info. Chris, you go first.
Oh man, so it frustrates me, but not top priority. Oh, there's a lot of. I'm trying to think. Like, there's actually not that many, but I'm sure there are. Like, I'm sure we've had a bunch of conversations. Like Jose's number one. Like, he has a lot of good sayings, but one of his great sayings is like the ship has sailed on that. So there's a lot of things that we're like, oh, we should do this or we should have done this, and he's like, nope, ship has sailed. Once you hit 1.0. So I'm trying to think if there's like any big things we would have changed. I mean, I think one thing that we've done a better job on, and by we, it's really Jose, pushing this side. But I think one thing we did a poor job of was compile time dependencies initially with like route helpers and importing things into the user's module space by default with the new project, where in retrospect that introduced a bunch of like compiler overhead. So I think Jose and the core team have done a lot of work recently about how to optimize compile times and do checks for people's applications to make sure they're not introducing a bunch of compiler dependencies. And I think it's been several years now that we've added a route alias instead of importing the helper. So I think over the years we've gotten better in that regard, but I think going back, that's one of the things that we could have avoided very easily just on the way that we generated the project code. I'm trying to think of like APIs that we have like slated for Phoenix 2.0, which there's no roadmap for. But I can't think at the moment. Jose, maybe you can jog my memory, anything that annoys us.
I think most frustrations, we do solve them as they come. And I think there are two things that is worth talking about. I think like a lot of the things, they may be frustrating and they are alternatives, but it's not clear if the alternative is any better, right? So it's a balancing of trade-offs. So if you have something that is done the way it is today and there is an alternative, but you can't really say that that alternative is really going to be better, then there is the question of like, if it was an early language, you could say like, let's try. But now you have to balance like, hey, is it worth putting all of our users through the hoop of like trying those different things, even if it's not better? And there is actually a good example for this, which is related to application configuration. So, you configure your Phoenix and Elixir applications with the config files. And there was a period we tried to, and we learned a lot of lessons with this process. And there was a period where we actually tried to take most of the configuration from the config files and put inside, collocated with, like, so if you wanted to configure the Phoenix endpoint, you would put all the configuration in the Phoenix endpoint. Or if you wanted to configure the repo, you would put that configuration with the repo. So we wanted to make the config files linear, right? So we thought like, hey, this is the way to go. And then when we tried the new approach, then people are like, this is not good because I want to configure my app and I don't know what I can configure because the configuration is now scattered about on like 10 or 12 different files, and this is very hard to follow. So sometimes I think it's just an example. Like, if something is a clear winner, I think like we'll just like, let's go and do it. But a lot of the times it's really unclear if it's the winner, and there are other times where there are things frustrating. So Chris is bringing up like compilation times, which is something that people have been saying, hey, it's not the compilation time that is bad. It's actually that when you do a change, a lot ends up being recompiling. Right? And there was a lot of progress in the recent Elixir releases, and the next Elixir release is going to be even better. So when you change a file, like fewer things are recompiled, but the things like if like I couldn't do the improvements that we are done for Elixir 1.13 like 3 years ago, and the reason why we couldn't do it is just because it's mostly because it was frustrating, but we just didn't know exactly how to fix that problem. And sometimes you fix another problem and then you realize that, oh, that thing that we added there can now help us solve this other thing. So there's a lot of development that is like kind of cross-related. So, but I think my joke, I said like, this is about the question is exactly that, like if there is something that we think it's frustrating, I think we just go and try to, if we can address it, we'll definitely try to address it. If there's a clear way forward, then I think that's good, and we jump on it.
I think the other thing I'll add there is the Phoenix presence. It's frustrating for us, but not, I mean, most all users it isn't a problem for, but the fact that we implemented an OR SWAT CRDT for that, which has like a pretty expensive operation when you merge data from different replicas. Like the fact, like it wasn't until we had built the whole thing that we realized that we could have cut out an expensive part of the operation. We didn't need to implement like the full part of the CRDT, just because there was a once you solve the complete problem, you actually realize what the complete problem is. So I think I initially made the error of not understanding that like the replicas own all of their data. So there's a conflict resolution step that doesn't need to happen when we merge presence data that would probably drastically speed up Phoenix presence. So it's frustrating to me that it's not something that that we can prioritize like immediately right now. And it's also good enough for most folks, like people are running 100,000 concurrent users through presence today. So like it still scales super well, but it is frustrating that if these companies that are using it at really, really high scale run into slowdowns, it's something that we would like to revisit. So it's frustrating in that respect, but it's also hard to prioritize because it works super well already. So I think stay tuned on that, but that's just something else that comes to mind.
Cool. So there was a question here. So Chris, how do you feel about DSLs designed for test purposes?
I'd have to see the specific example. I think DSLs, it's coming from me. This is actually, yeah. So coming from a framework creator, it's easy for me to say, all right, I can be like, most DSLs are not worth it, but that's coming from someone who gets to write DSLs. So I would need to see a specific example. I think DSLs can be powerful, and it depends by what folks mean by DSL. Like, is the Phoenix contest or live view tested DSL where you can just say get this URL or assert something was broadcasted. I wouldn't consider that necessarily DSL, but if you go fully the other direction where it's like all you do is use macros to have a declarative test for everything, and you're not actually writing Elixir that's more using test utilities, I think that is usually more restrictive than necessary, but I can only speak in the abstract, so I would need to see an actual example. But I think DSLs in general are very powerful, but you got to be careful because the moment you want to do something more broad, usually it doesn't well serve you.
Yeah, what does the audience think about test-based DSLs? It's definitely a polemic topic. Want to try a show of hands? Who is in favor, thinks it can really be a boost for productivity? Is there anybody? Okay, very few hands, a couple. And who is like, nope, I'm not touching it, no way. Very extreme the other side. Okay, so, and who is like, sure, if it's well designed, why not? Okay, so, yeah. I think I'm going to say one thing about DSLs. It is a funny question to ask. Somebody one day was asking me, what do I think about not invented here syndrome? And I was like, yeah, don't ask me that. It created a programming language, it's. And then you're talking hey, you create a web framework. What do you think about DSLs? It's going to be a bit biased. But I think the main thing about DSLs that I learned throughout the years is that the DSL should always be a layer on top of a declarative, on top of a proper functional usable API. The huge majority of the times. There are some cases where it's just fine for it to not be, but in a lot of the cases, That's what you should aim for. Like the building blocks for the DSL should always be exposed. That is going to help your DSL to be cleaner, and it's going to be easier to test. It's going to be easier to extend. Only good things are going to come out of it. And a very curious tidbit. Actually, my first talk in English ever was at Eruco that was happening in Krakow. And the title of the talk was DSL or no DSL. So that's and exploring different approaches we had in the Ruby community at the time, and some that was very DSL based, some that were not a lot DSL based, and the pros and cons. And I remember being very glad because Matt said he liked my talk, so that was cool.
And I'll add to that real quick, Jose. Your comment about the DSL also having a functional API is actually, I think, extremely important, and Plug is a great example of that. And just like one thing from 2 days ago, so FIO is playing with Elixir. They're really excited about it, obviously, because they hired me. But one of the fun things is like I get to live vicariously through them discovering Elixir and things they can do with Phoenix and LiveView. But this Plug example is perfect because they wanted, like, they're playing with Elixir and they're like, oh my gosh, let's deploy something and get this serving our users. And one example was there's a reverse proxy plug that exists on Hex that can take requests and then do a reverse proxy. So they wanted to say, like, what if we could just carve out this part of our stack and serve it with Phoenix? And the reverse proxy plug did like 95% of what they needed, but they were like, we needed to say, like, for this special circumstance, we needed to behave differently. And I think in most other platforms, they were like, well, this isn't going to work. And I gave them like a 6-line of code snippet, which was just their own plug that just did the check and then called, reverse proxy plug.call and passed the connection in with their options. So I think that was just one example recently where the DSL abstraction had like a very obvious answer that, like, in retrospect, like it blew people's minds, like, oh, I could just call the code. But I think most other ecosystems, it would just be a DSL that would kind of be untouchable as far as userland is concerned.
Yeah, I think in our conversation, something that comes up a lot related to DSLs, or because Phoenix is actually the Phoenix core. Let's say it's a bunch of packages like Phoenix, Phoenix HTML, Phoenix LiveView. And one of the things that we talk a lot is also like no cheating. And what we mean by that is like Phoenix LiveView, even though it's like the same people who are working on Phoenix LiveView are using Phoenix, we are not allowed to use any private APIs or any specific DSLs or things. Like, so everything that we need, we'll go and we'll make it public and figure out the proper way of doing it in Phoenix. Exactly. I think the no cheating is good for many reasons. I think it can be a good sign of a healthy ecosystem, because if somebody wants to, like, hey, I actually have a similar idea to LiveView and I want to try a different approach, like, all the abstractions are going to be there, right? They're not going to rely on the hacks if we have gone that route. And also, again, in terms of the API being clear and being readable. Yeah. I'm going to read the next question. There was one, I'm not finding it, I'm going to paraphrase it, which is, what the community can do better to improve the growth of Elixir and Phoenix. Help with docs, blog posts, contributions on GitHub. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I think that, like, we have conversations around this. The community, as in we, have conversations, every year, like, how can we do better? How can we grow? I think, if evangelizing continues to be a good thing. So I think depending on, like, whether you want to do open source contributions or you don't have time to, ship a bunch of code, but you can evangelize in your company, train people. I think there's a book that Jose co-authored, Adopting Elixir, if you're interested on how to actually get Elixir into a company. So I think that there's that side of things. And then on the actual open source side of things, I think what people don't realize about open source is, like, there's a shockingly small amount of contributors building the tools that you use every day, whether it's the language, the web framework, or whatever little utility library you're using. And my personal experience is a lot of people want to get involved with docs or code, but don't, even though they're like, they tell me how I can get involved. And then I tell them like, get involved, find us on Slack, follow the issue tracker. So I think in general, people feel like they need to have permission to get involved. And even when they're given permission, I still feel like they don't feel like they're like worthy of contributing. But I will say that, like, yeah, shockingly few people are actually become contributors. And I'd love to see that change. I don't know what the right answer is other than to tell people that like even small contributions, that's usually the best way to get started, but make a big difference for projects. So I think like if you want to get involved, if this is something that you're passionate about, like find the maintainers on Slack and literally just jump in is the best way to do it. So I think that I would love to see the community getting more involved on pull requests and documentation. I think we do a good job, but in general, I think there's still a small amount of contributors to what I hear from people telling me like, oh, I'd love to help out.
I always like to say, go with your pains, right? Like, so if you are feeling any pain at your work, like in the sense of like, oh, there's something that is not clear, or we are missing this thing to make our life easier, because in my previous ecosystem, we had a tool that could do that, and now this tool is not available here, and maybe we could have a tool. Or I like to say, like, always go with your pains, or if you solved a challenge or solve a problem that was not clear to you, you can go and write a blog post about it, how you did that and how you tackled it. And I like to say there is no small contributions. I talked to a lot of people where they're like, oh, we did this, and then I'm like, oh, you should write a blog post about it, and then they're like, no, I think that's like too small or easy or like obvious, like, oh, we talk a lot about this, like after I found out the solution, it was really easy, right? And it's like, yes, the hard part is finding out the solution, right? So all those things, they definitely help, right? Like just writing about what you're doing, contributions, small things in the docs, and then to the other areas that Chris was talking about, the code level and so on. So going back to the frustrations questions, right? Going with what is frustrating you can be a good way to go about it. How much time do we have? It goes into when? Okay, so we have like 13 minutes about, okay? So there is a question I wanted to leave at the end, but I'm not sure if I'm going to time it correctly, so I'll just go ahead and ask it now. What is on? There were 3 or 4 questions about Elixir and Phoenix roadmap, so I'm going to try to consolidate all on this one. So Chris, what is the long term for Phoenix? Long term is 1 year plus.
1 year plus. So I mean, it's probably not a surprise to folks that LiveView remains at least my immediate focus. I think Phoenix, if you're building JSON APIs or GraphQL APIs, like there's the answer there. That's baked. That's not going to change. So I think as far as my focus, LiveView and how to build distributed applications around LiveView will be my immediate focus. So I think that's not a surprise to folks. We talked about kind of what we want to see in LiveView before 1.0. So I think that's kind of been well trotted out. But I think me joining Fly.io, one thing that I want to start really focusing on is what does it look like to run a distributed Elixir application with LiveView running, geographically by users. So there are a lot of interesting problems there around if you've got data across the ocean, how do you fetch that efficiently, and what kind of patterns exist to build an app that way. And I think one of the really interesting things that sounds crazy is like you could even do kind of like server optimistic UI on the server with this kind of setup. So there's a lot of really neat ideas that I think will sound really like bad ideas to people. Just like when they first saw LiveView, they're like, this can't be good. So I think there are some cool things that I'm interested to try kind of in the near term that I think will actually prove out to be pretty interesting solutions.
Yeah, so for Elixir, I don't know when, it was in ElixirConf United States, the last one we had before the COVID break. My talk was about how Elixir we have a empty backlog. It doesn't mean that we're no longer working on it, and you can see, right, like there's still, that was when 1.9 come out and we are heading towards 1.13. But what an empty backlog means is that, it's like now there are no big features planned. We'll just continue evolving the language based on feedback, based on frustrations, for example, that we hear people. And that's how Elixir has been going for, I would say, since then in terms of releases, right? We are doing improvements, we are improving compilation times, right? Which are pains that you only hear from people that are, after they're working on a project for a while and they're like, hey, we are running into this case and we wish it could be faster. So that has been our focus. So there is nothing really flashy to talk about. Elixir 1.3 on 1.13 in particular is going to have two main things that I think affect developers all indirectly. So one is improvement to the compilation times. We talked a little bit about. And the other one is we are starting to add some functions to understand fragments of code, right? And the reason why this is important is because if you're working, everybody here is using an editor or at least an editor, and some are using an IDE with advanced features like auto-completion, suggestions, kind of things. And the tricky thing about those tools is that they often they often need to work with incomplete Elixir code or Elixir code that is wrong. Like imagine that you are typing some code and then you type 1 plus, that 1 plus until you write what is after the plus, that is incomplete code, right? Like that does not compile Elixir, but the editor needs to be smart enough to say, hey, this is an incomplete Elixir code, but the user wants a suggestion anyway. So there has been a great effort from people working on editor tooling, the Elixir language server protocol, Elixir Sense, and now with Livebook having its editor and giving suggestions to user about auto-completion and so on. We are focusing on bringing this functionality to the language so the ecosystem can build on top, right? So you get a feeling of where we are going with Elixir. It's really we're just it's polishing, right? We are polishing everything that is in there and continue improving, which aligns well with the language goals, right? Because the language goal is to be extensible. Everybody should be able to get the language and build a web framework, build something like Nerves, and more recently something for machine learning without really changing the language. So not really a lot changing on Elixir. And then there is a question still related to roadmap. I'll go first, Chris, and then you tie it up, which is if there is anything that we want to remove for 2.0. So for Elixir, I can say that we will have a 2.0 at some point, but it's not coming anytime soon. So with time, you probably saw deprecations in your Elixir code, and in the past, as the language was evolving, we were much more aggressive about deprecating APIs, but now things have stabilized considerably. So my plan for Elixir 2.0 is that if you run, so imagine that we're going to release Elixir 2.0 when Elixir is 1.40 or something like that, right? Like in 10 years from now or something like that. My idea is that if you can run 1.40 without warnings, Elixir 2.0 is going to work. Just work. You don't have to do anything, right? So the idea is that everything that we want to remove is going to be deprecated. So Elixir 2.0 is just we are tired of carrying those deprecations, and we will say okay, let's flip, right? And I have some ideas about making this really smooth. Even now, we could have some kind of future flag that you pass to Elixir, and then it kind of disables the deprecated functionality, so you get actual crashes and things like that. So we can all be super prepared, and the transition is as smooth as it can be. As never seen before, let's say. And Chris, anything you think, any plans for 2.0? Anything that you think should wait for 2.0 or something like that?
Not in the immediate future. I'm just looking through what we have tagged in the Phoenix code base for V2, and it's nothing feature-wise, just really small things. People remember when Poison was kind of the default JSON decoder. like there's a bunch of little things like historically where, the JSON package came around and we replaced Poison with JSON for new projects. But the Phoenix, we didn't want to break other people using Poison. So there's a call out that like eventually we'll remove this default Poison JSON decoder in Phoenix, even though most people today aren't using Poison. Little bunch of small things like that. We also supported like the system tuple before runtime config was solved. You could do like, I want to fetch this system port export environment variable. So like those kind of like little things we want to remove now that we have like, we experienced the issue, we came up with a solution in Phoenix or Elixir, and now like those are kind of just cruft, but they're like really small things. One of the bigger ones that we have called out, I just now that I thought like I just breezed through everything real quick, is like we want to remove a bunch of the code injection that we do. So it turns out like when you're injecting code and it looks like you learn lessons over time. And one of the things that we do, like if you use Phoenix controller, is we import the plug.con API. So there's a lot of things that in retrospect we shouldn't have automatically imported things into user code because to understand what's being, like when you say use Phoenix controller, you have to actually go look at the source to find out what code is being brought in. So when V2 comes around, I think we would remove that import by default. And, we could even add it into like your WebEx file to like so you see what's being brought in at least. So I think even the upgrade path there, like, out of the box, technically everyone's controllers would break, but it would probably be a one-line change to say like, oh, I import it in my userland code, not Phoenix doing it. So I think that's one of the bigger things, but really it's a very small change. So I don't think any APIs at the moment are subject to like big changes.
Yeah, because we say like, hey, you want to know everything that is in your controller, you can look at the WebEx file, but yeah, then the use Phoenix controller is actually importing a couple of things, so there are some things behind the scenes. But I'm thinking we could already start importing plug.con today, and nothing would break. Do we already do that?
I don't think so. So that actually would be a great idea. So
yeah.
Then
so if somebody,
maybe 1.6.0 goes final, you'll be future-proof as far as that breaking change.
So if somebody wants to send a pull request, you can make it so we change the new app generator to import plug.con in the dev controller for WebEx, and that's going to prepare everybody for Phoenix 2.0 coming 15 years from now. Cool. Do we have time for more questions? Do I get it? Okay. All right, Chris, what is, in your opinion, the top 3 anti-patterns that we, developers, apply when we use Phoenix and we should stop?
Top 3 is tough. One, I think, so like
we can work together.
All these answers for me.
We can work together. Right, I'll start with one. So one that we see developers doing from time to time, not necessarily specific for Phoenix, but it happens in Phoenix applications, is starting processes when they should not. Like using processes as a mechanism for design. Like, oh, I'm going to create this process here, this Gen server, to model my interactions with the users. Like, no, process, they're not a design tool, they're not a code organization tool. And I think it's natural to be clear. It's like you are learning a new language, a new paradigm, and then like, hey, how things fit together. And one of the important things is that processes, they're not for code organization. Processes, they exist to model runtime properties of our system. Be concurrency, state, resilience to failures, but it's not for code organization. So that's one. Can you think of other ones?
So the big one for me, this is going to sound really rich coming from me, but overuse of macros. So someone wrote a book that told people to use a bunch of macros, which I still stand by that. If you're learning macros, absolutely go all out. But I think that people tend to, like working in a consultancy, inheriting code that I think they really want to use macros because they find them interesting. They're like, oh, I can solve this. But the vast majority of the time on inherited code that I've encountered, like it could have just been a function call. So I think that macros in general are like, I think you should start with this is an anti-pattern. If your answer is, oh, I need to write a macro for this, start with the assumption that you're wrong, and then prove to yourself that you actually need it. So I think that's an obvious one. Along the process point that Jose mentioned, using processes for code organization is poor design. Also using umbrella applications for code organization is usually an anti-pattern. I like to say that like umbrella applications should be like you should have a separate application along the order of how you want to actually deploy an application. It could all be deployed in the same VM, but like if you want to say like I have this application that might be doing heavy CPU intensive work, so when I do it as a mono repo, but when I deploy it, I put it on a node over here, and it runs on its own. That way, it can do CPU intensive work and not slow down web requests. So I think what we see folks doing instead a lot of the time is making a separate umbrella app when really they just wanted like a separate lib directory for just code organization purposes. That's a big one that comes to mind.
Yeah, and the cool thing is that I think all those things that we talked about, they are in the docs. So the docs, I mean, I don't I don't want to say like, oh, you should have read the docs. That's not what I mean. It's just that because there are a lot of docs. So but if you get to stumble into them, it's like it's advice that we do give, like, hey, don't use this for that. So there is a page in the Elixir documentation called Library Guidelines. If you haven't checked that out, you can Google it, Elixir Library Guidelines. It's in our docs that have a bunch of like, hey, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. A bunch of small ones. One of the small ones that I see people committing from time to time, and it's a very easy to remember is. This is very small compared to the other things we're talking about, but is if we use task async, you must await, okay? That's something you have to keep in mind because it is designed for somebody eventually receiving a response of that thing. And then if you just want to start a fire and forget task, then you can look for the module and the other APIs in that module. But if you do a task async, you must await. Now that we said those things, has anybody going back home thinking I have homework to do? No? Good. Very good.
I have one more.
Okay.
This one.
Ask 3 and you get 5.
I'll try to collect. Okay, yeah. I'll try to collect. Like I don't know the right way to phrase it, but I think along the process idea, I think people coming from other platforms, this whole idea of a preemptive scheduler with green threads is very new for a lot of people. At least it was for me. So what we see people do is they come from a language that either has no real concurrency primitives or very poor threading or just threading, and they think that they need to like slice up the work granularly themselves, which leads to a poor scaling solution. So like one example is at Docker, we inherited an application that did a bunch of external API calls and then based on results inserted into a database. And we had a indexing task that took 6 days when we got the app. We just refactored the code to run in 6 hours. Same Postgres database, just using proper process primitives. So I think people come from a language where they just throw things into like a Sidekick or Redis job queue, and then they're used to thinking like, well, I can't block the quote unquote app because I'm either blocking the web request thread or I throw it into a worker, but then I only have, let's say, 16 threads running workers at one time. So I can't just allow that thread worker to block, let's say, for 30 seconds to do a big job. I need to time slice that myself too. So they come to Elixir and they think like, oh, I get cheap concurrency. So I'm going to start a process to make this one HTTP request. I'm going to start a process. And then when that's done, I'm going to start another process to go do something else. And they're going too granularly, if that makes sense. It's hard to explain, but what we did when we refactored the code base is like, no, we just start a process to do a unit of a work. And then you can make concurrent HTTP requests within that process, but instead of thinking about this idea of like every async operation is got to be like some quote unquote job, and then you have to kind of coordinate. I think I see folks breaking things down too much in the job queue idea versus start a process to do a unit of work that should potentially do other things, start other processes that link to them. if that makes any sense. So using processes as a job queue is an anti-pattern that I see quite often.
Cool. And I'll do the last one. Chris, what are the biggest improvements you'd personally like to see in the Elixir ecosystem?
I think we do a fantastic job. I'm trying to think of like Jose said, a lot of things are typically frustration based. So there's nothing that really bothers me day to day that I wish would change, because if that happens, like I said, all my answers, like I have a very privileged position. Like if something frustrates me, I either can improve it in Phoenix because I control that, or I bug Jose because he and I collaborate. So most things that I personally want to see happen have happened. So I'm trying to think if there's anything large. I mean, I think one thing that if people that know me, like Dockyard folks, I very much complain about dialyzer quite a bit. I think that it's powerful, but I would love to see less pain in kind of the static analysis side of things for folks that want that. Because personally, for me, anytime dialyzer, if I'm forced to use it, I will use it. But anytime it's pushed on me, it adds more pain than value to me. So that's probably my biggest frustration on projects, just being forced to live through that pain, where I see the value in an idealized world, but I don't get the value in reality. So I think that could be improved.
Who here wishes Elixir was a little... Okay, who here wishes that Elixir was a lot more statically typed? Please raise your hands. Okay. A little bit more? And who thinks like, no types, please stop? Okay, cool. So at least half would be on the little bit more, and I think like...
I would go on the little bit more side.
What?
I didn't want to... I would say the little bit more would be good.
Yeah.
I didn't want to go down the static type wormhole there, but yeah, I mean, I think I'm a big dynamic type fan, but if the computer can tell me I'm wrong instead of me finding out runtime, then yeah, great.
I just realized the order asked the questions can also be totally biased, right? So I'll do it again. I'll reverse the order and see if anything changed, okay? So who is like, no types, please? Raise your hands. It's 3 options, okay? Who would like a little bit more, but like don't go full crazy on it, okay? And who's like, yes, turn it all in. Okay, you're raising 2, it doesn't count, man. Cool. Yeah, so for me, when it comes to what I would like to see in the ecosystem, my answer, if anybody's asked me this question, you know what my answer is going to be, and it's like, my opinion is, I think my opinion is not very relevant in the sense that it should, like, what the community wants next or the ecosystem thinks what needs to be next, like, it's up for the ecosystem to decide. And the reason why I say this is because if it depended on me, we would not have a lot of the great things that we have in the ecosystem today. So for example, even Phoenix, so who started in Elixir very early on? Who started Elixir before 1.0 came out? Okay, very few hands, right? So before, in the very early days, when Phoenix was coming out, like there were a lot of web frameworks trying to be a web framework and bringing ideas from Rails and other places. But for me, like the thing that I really liked about Phoenix and what Chris did was exactly because it was like, hey, it's not thinking about like, hey, can we be like Django on Elixir or can we be Rails on Elixir? It's like, no, like it's real time, right? It's like, it's saying, look, we have this platform that is fantastic for this, and it's really thinking, it's like it's flipping the problem in its head, right? It's not like, hey, how can we bring the other things? That's not the question we should ask. The question is, how can we use the platform to build other things, right? So I think that's what I found fantastic, and it's an idea that I would never have had, even coming from this web development background. And similarly with things like nerves, right? If somebody say like, hey, what would be great for Elixir? I would never answer nerves, something for building embedded software, right? And then we have a bunch of other examples like membrane and so on. So yeah, I think like the next big ideas, they are not coming from us, they are coming from you. So, go for it. Cool. I think this is it. So what do I do now?